The Spin-Off Podcast Network. This podcast was made with the support of New Zealand On Air.
In the mid-90s, a two-part drama called Fallout aired on New Zealand TV. Written by Tom Scott and Greg McGee, it's an engrossing reconstruction of the Lange government's anti-nuclear stance and clash with the United States. The part of Richard Armitage, US Assistant Secretary of State, is played by John Divbig, an American actor and basketball enthusiast resident in New Zealand. Perfect casting.
The expatriate American who played me was great in terms of being heavy and bald.
That's Armitage, speaking to us from his home in Virginia. He had a few issues with the dramatisation, but one especially.
I think I called, after that came out, somebody involved in it and said I wanted to complain. And I was at, complain about what? And I said, well, as I recall, the documentary or movie had me saying that Mr. Lange was a shitbag. And I said I would never have used that terminology. As an American, I would have always used the American phrase, a bag of shit.
Can we quote you on that?
I have never been off the record.
Richard Armitage was an Asia-Pacific specialist. He'd served in the region, as had his father before him. We'll hear more from him shortly. So far in this series, we've touched on the nuclear issue and New Zealand's place in the world, but now it's time to dive right in there. The snap election of 1984 is sparked by a nuclear-free bill in the name of Richard Prebble. Marilyn Waring crosses the floor, Rob Muldoon goes to the polls, Labour pledges nuclear-free status, but prioritises the state of the economy in its campaign. But in no time at all, the nuclear issue is centre stage. The backdrop is a Cold War that has cleaved the globe into two ideological camps, led by superpowers the United States and the Soviet Union. The spectre of nuclear apocalypse is everywhere. New Zealand becomes embroiled in a bitter standoff with its Western ally. Its leader is catapulted to the status of international champion for nuclear disarmament, and a European nuclear state exacts terrorism and death in the harbour of Tamaki Makaurau. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Toby Manhire and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Episode 3, Uranium on Your Breath.
We deeply regret the decision by the New Zealand government to deny port access to our ships.
We hope that the new Labour government will take strong action against the French.
And I'm going to give it to you if you hold your breath, just for a moment. I can smell the uranium on it as you lean towards me.
Explosions rang out from the 40-metre ship at about midnight, and the crew scrambled to get off the vessel to safety as she began going under.
A sordid act of international state-backed terrorism.
We're going to go back again to those dark and stormy nights after the 1984 election. Sound the thunder, please, Te Ai here. We've traversed already the financial and constitutional crisis, but these days will also play host to some seminal moments in New Zealand foreign policy. Take it all together, and this is a frantic, giddy overture for the years that will follow. There's a big fancy summit being held in Wellington's big fancy hotel, the James Cook on the Terrace. It's for ANZUS, the security alliance between Australia, New Zealand and the United States. The timing is terrible. Labour has won the election, but it is not in power. Lange & Co won't be sworn in for several days, so they can't formally take part. Lange had asked Muldoon to postpone the thing. Muldoon had told him where to go. When the Americans and the Australians arrive into a vicious Wellington southerly the day after the election, Lange flies down from Auckland to greet them. But that's just a diplomatic nicety. The meeting that matters comes 3 days later. It's July 17, the day after Lange has gone on the TV and said Muldoon is putting the nation at risk over his refusal to devalue the currency.
This nation is at risk. That is how basic...
George Shultz, the US Secretary of State, visits the Prime Minister-elect in his Parliament office. Both men are acutely aware of the stakes. While Labour's economic policy had been an exercise in strategic ambiguity, here the pledges are emphatic and precise. Labour will ban nuclear-armed and powered warships. It will legislate to make New Zealand nuclear-free. It will pursue a nuclear-free zone in the Pacific and re-examine the ANZUS Treaty. Scholz emerges from the meeting in good cheer. He's convinced that he's secured an important undertaking from Lange. Give him 6 months to smooth the corners in the Labour Party, and an American ship can set sail for New Zealand.
Scholz did think that, but it wasn't true.
This is Geoffrey Palmer.
You see, the Americans thought that we would buckle because the Australian government had the same policy before it was elected, and they were elected before us, and they did buckle. And we didn't, because we had run on this policy, and if you'd compromised it, you would have got into big political trouble.
A decade later, TVNZ journalist Richard Harmon travels to the US for the documentary 5 Days in July. He secures an interview with Scholz, who essentially confirms that he felt Lange had said he'd sort things out.
Interestingly, off-camera, Scholz said that what really upset him about the situation was that he went back to Reagan and told Reagan not to worry about New Zealand, that everything was sorted. And, of course, it wasn't. He felt his own integrity was on the line over this.
New Zealand had hardly lurched to nuclear-free mode overnight.
It's always been a very strong strain in Labour Party politics. I think also to some extent in New Zealand politics.
This is Margaret Wilson, Labour Party president from 1984.
We had history on this. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise to anybody that we just are not going to tolerate nuclear weapons.
In 1973, New Zealand and Australia had taken France to The Hague, seeking a ban on the nuclear tests in the Pacific. They won. France said, meh, and carried on. So Norman Kirk, who's the Prime Minister at this point, sends a frigate, HMNZS Otago, to Mururoa. It accompanies a whole lot of protest yachts, including the Free.
In a dramatic move at about 11 o'clock New Zealand time, 3 French warships converged on the Free, 20 miles from Mururoa, and 15 sailors boarded the protest yacht with orders to take it in tow. This is Sean Brown on board the Otago.
When Muldoon takes power in 1975, he derides a foreign policy built on sanctimonious humbug and invites the US to send vessels, nuclear or not, to New Zealand. When those vessels arrive, so do flotillas of protest.
I remember going out on a boat. I'm not a great sailor, it was a bit scary.
This is Fran Wilde, Wellington Central MP for Labour from 1981.
I mean, if you think about that generation again, who grew up, and the French were testing in the Pacific, and we had the Cold War going on and mutually assured destruction. It was not a good time. And I can remember when I was a kid, the Bay of Pigs. I can remember that happening and how scared we were as kids. We thought that it would be nuclear annihilation.
The activists of this emerging generation, the baby boomers, are suspicious of ANZUS. Signed in 1951 in the shadow of the Second World War, with an eye on security in the Pacific, the treaty is a big part of why New Zealand commits troops to America's disastrous war in Vietnam. That conflict, and New Zealand's part in it, sparks the political awakening of people like Helen Clark, Phil Goff and Fran Wilde.
The whole world was going nuts. The students in Paris and in the US, everything. We saw it on television every night, basically. And then that just started happening here as well. And we knew what was going on, and Vietnam was the most incredibly terrible war. It should never have happened.
So, Labour's policy in 1984 is not just about nuclear risks, it's also about independence.
It was all tied up with ANZUS and the American alliance. Did we have our own foreign policy, or were we just an add-on to the Americans?
From the American perspective, New Zealand is a pain in the arse and a pebble in the shoe. This is the Cold War, after all, with 2 superpowers entwined in the doctrine of mutually assured destruction.
We're engaged in a huge global conflict with the Soviet Union. They were devoting enormous resources, particularly in Japan and secondarily in Australia, to undermine our nuclear posture and to develop anti-nuclear fervor.
I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Lange, as opposition leader, had visited Washington and met high-ranking figures, including Richard Armitage.
We entertained him in my office at the Pentagon and explained the necessity for our neither confirm nor deny policy.
That policy, to neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons on naval vessels, is a core American Cold War mantra. The deterrent strategy, they say, means the enemy must not know where the nukes might be floating.
He listened carefully, said he understood it. From my point of view, he was disingenuous or lied. He told me in front of witnesses from New Zealand he understood the need for our policy. We did realize that there was a great anti-nuclear fervor building in New Zealand, as there was in Australia, that didn't have the same political courage to face it down in New Zealand as we had in Australia.
Lange would later put it this way in an interview for the doco series Revolution.
I was opposed to nuclear weaponry, and I wasn't opposed to nuclear-propelled warships, not open slather.
David was probably hedging his bets.
By the time he has become Prime Minister, Lange's position has firmed. A few days after that meeting with Schultz, Lange is asked whether the new government might follow the Australian example.
I have absolutely no plan to do that. I have been the subject of much representation by interests from the United States and Australia in the run-up to the election and since the election. Not the slightest sign of that buckling has taken place as far as I am concerned. It is basic to our policy. It is in the interest of New Zealand's security, and it is something which our friends will themselves accommodate to. We don't have, as a matter of an imperative, the duty to receive nuclear armaments into New Zealand or nuclear propulsion, and I know that our partners know that, and they will respect us when we insist on it.
Do you believe that we will see the visit of an American nuclear warship to a New Zealand port between now and when we go to the next election?
No, I don't. I don't think we will. I don't think we will, and I don't think that'll mean the end of ANZUS either.
A few days later, President Ronald Reagan takes a question in the East Room of the White House.
Young lady right there.
Thank you. Mr. President, could the United States continue its defense commitments to New Zealand if it's denied port access for nuclear ships? And if this happens, would it affect American trade with New Zealand?
I don't think that would affect trade, but I do know, and I would rather not get in too deeply to anything, because that is something that will be worked out and negotiated with the new government of New Zealand. And I have every reason to be optimistic that there won't be any denial to our ships.
That point on trade's an important one. Even at the most strained moments, Schultz is clear on this too. Whatever the repercussions might be for New Zealand's stance, trade sanctions are not on the table. As for that 6-month question, on January the 17th, 1984, 6 months to the day after that Lange-Schultz meeting in Wellington, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs receives a formal request for a port visit. At about the same time, David Lange sets off for one of the most remote places in the world.
You have to remember that Tokelau is part of the realm of New Zealand. It is a responsibility. Lange felt, and I think this was a correct feeling, that he should make a visit there.
We're talking to Geoffrey Palmer in his office at the Victoria University Law Faculty, in the majestic old government buildings in Wellington. He still comes in most days, at the age of 82. In the first term of the fourth Labour government, Palmer has a lot of deputising to do. Not only is David Lange the Prime Minister, he also takes on the role of Foreign Minister.
So he went up there, but it's 3 days steaming from Samoa. Now, I mean, it's very remote. And so he went up and he was incommunicado. You couldn't communicate with him. You couldn't get him on the phone. And so this came up, these leaks happened. I had to, as acting Prime Minister, deal with it.
The reports in newspapers in Australia and the US reveal there has been a request for a ship visit. The ally is being tested. Palmer can't get a secure connection with Lange and is left to deal with an unnerved caucus and an increasingly vocal party.
We had a special executive meeting about it, and I think, I know Geoffrey came. I just said to him, if in fact you go ahead with the vote to let in the ship, then you will have a serious division.
Margaret Wilson makes it clear the party absolutely will not back down on this issue. In fact, the demand has been tightened. Not only are nuclear-armed and nuclear-powered ships off limits, anything capable of being nuclear-armed is a no-go. And if that means a major split between the party and Labour MPs, so be it.
It was the one thing everybody seemed united on, to be honest. It was the only time I felt I would have resigned, I think, and probably a lot of others, because it would be such a breach of faith, basically, and trust to do that.
One of the leading voices in opposition to a ship visit at this point is the spokesperson for the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships, an eloquent 26-year-old by the name of Nicky Hager. Hager has a fascinating, maybe even pivotal, cameo in this story. It's a role we didn't learn about until 2023, when Hager, these days an acclaimed investigative journalist, delivered the Michael King Lecture at the University of Otago.
I've been thinking for a long time about recording this history, but I waited until it felt right to tell things where I'd been sworn to secrecy. Now, with the passage of time, nearly everyone I'm going to mention is dead. And anyway, I think they would only be proud of the things which I'm going to reveal.
At the end of 1984, Hager had published a detailed list of the US Navy vessels that are nuclear-powered or nuclear-armed. Since news of the ship request has broken, he's been part of a campaign to send thousands of protest letters to MPs. In the middle of this maelstrom, around the time that Lange is on the steamer from Tokelau to Samoa, Hager gets a call. It's the Defence Minister, Frank O'Flynn. He asks Hager to come to his home on the fringes of the town belt in Thorndon.
When I'd arrived and was sitting in his very neat living room, he said he had the bundle of advice from the officials on whether to accept the US ship visit. But he said he wasn't sure what to make of the advice or what he should do. Would I confidentially read the official documents he had received and tell him what I thought?
O'Flynn is the only minister who has been permitted to read the advice before cabinet meets.
And so there I was, reading the secret advice that almost no one else had seen. 2 Ministry of Defence documents were stamped secret, and 2 more came from the External Intelligence Bureau. Frank O'Flynn was breaking the law by showing them to me. I was a little bemused, wondering why he'd trusted me. The papers named the ship that the US Navy wanted to visit New Zealand, a destroyer called the USS Buchanan. I recognised the name, which only weeks earlier I'd included in the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships list of all US nuclear warships and submarines that were banned from New Zealand under the nuclear-free policy. The official advice also had 36 pages of facts and arguments, all supporting the ship visit proposal.
The essence of the advice? It is most unlikely the Buchanan would be carrying nukes.
The government basically had been manoeuvred into a corner where it was hard to say no.
Hager tells O'Flynn that to allow the visit would sign a death warrant for the nuclear-free policy. The slippery slope would have begun. A nuclear-armed ship would arrive before long.
I had an idea for a plan. When I'd researched the list of all the nuclear-armed and powered US Navy ships, most US Navy ships and submarines, in fact, by far, were installed with nuclear weapon systems. But I remembered one modern class of guided missile frigates that had no nuclear weapon systems. It was called the Oliver Hazard Perry class. I suggested to Frank O'Flynn that he propose to Cabinet that they reject the visit by the Buchanan, but tell the Americans that the government would accept the visit by a warship from the Oliver Hazard Perry class, which would clearly fit the New Zealand policy. The ship could come and go without breaching the nuclear-free policy, and if it did come, there would not be a precedent for later visits by nuclear-capable ships.
But hang on, why had the Minister of Defence asked this young activist to come to his house?
I learned the answer in a chance meeting many years later. It wasn't that O'Flynn had heard me in the news or anything like that. It was something much more pleasingly in New Zealand. Back on that January 1985 weekend, Frank O'Flynn had been pacing around his house in Grant Road, complaining to his family that he didn't know what to make of the advice he was reading. He asked, "Who can I talk to who would be trustworthy?" It was Frank's daughter, Richard O'Flynn, who had the idea. She told their father she knew me and I'd be reliable.
At about the same time that Harger is visiting O'Flynn, the Deputy Prime Minister, Geoffrey Palmer, is typing out a letter to David Lange to be personally taken by Lange's press secretary, Ross Vintner, to give to him as soon as he steps off the boat in American Samoa. Remember, this is a Deputy Prime Minister himself just 6 months into the job, suddenly finding himself in the middle of a very public foreign policy storm. Memorandum to the Prime Minister. From Deputy Prime Minister. Developments. There have been massive developments on the ship request, Palmer writes. I have done my best, but it has been necessary to take some rather big initiatives on the publicity front, about which it was impossible to consult you because there was no secure way of doing so. Australian pressure has been very hot, writes Palmer. Washington Embassy of Australia leaking against us. There have been developments in party, culminating in executive resolution. He attaches the official's advice about whether the Buchanan carries nukes. He hasn't read it yet. The Defence Minister, Frank O'Flynn, has. The official advice in O'Flynn's summary, we should let it in. But O'Flynn's own view is, the evidence is not sufficient to convince the public it will not be carrying weapons, and therefore we should refuse the request. The memo ends on another subject. Concerns are swirling internally around the idea that Lange might go to the Oxford Union to debate the right-wing televangelist Jerry Falwell on nuclear weapons. A trusted confidant has warned that to go there would be a disaster, and foreign diplomats are agog at the prospect. Harger is right. Officials had been engaged in extended negotiations ahead of the formal request. A few months earlier, the New Zealand Chief of Defence, Ewan Jamieson, had gone to see Admiral William Crowe, the US Commander of Pacific Forces, in Hawaii. It's there that they'd settled on the Buchanan as a kind of compromise. Surely, no one will reasonably think that the Buchanan, considered a clapped-out destroyer, is carrying nukes.
The USS Buchanan was an older ship, hence very unlikely to be nuclear capable. We would not say that because of our global interest and the precedent it might set. But that was the fact, and every single military person would have understood that.
One of the officials who prepares advice for ministers on the ship request is Gerald Hensley. Hensley, who has published fascinating accounts of his time as head of the Prime Minister's Department, died in February 2024. Here he is in 2004.
We concluded that it was highly unlikely that it was nuclear armed. That was officials' understatement, meaning it was not. We could not say legally it was not. We had not been over the ship from keel to truck. But by saying it was highly unlikely and giving our reasons, I certainly thought that we're making it quite plain.
For Geoffrey Palmer, who is being lobbied by a determined Labour Party and is of course a lawyer, not plain enough.
The advice that we got was inherently ambiguous because it confirmed the neither confirm nor deny policy.
Hensley will later say that Lange had been well aware of the elegant Buchanan solution, and in claiming he'd not been in the loop, had told fibs. Palmer is not so sure.
I think that there's a lot been said about what Lange knew or didn't know. I can't attest to any of that. All I'll say is that Gerald Hensley's criticism of him was, I thought, rather unfair, and I never had any dealings with Hensley over this at all, and we really followed the evidence. These people are not in charge of the politics of it. That's what the elected members do. It has to be, these decisions have to be made by elected people, and they were made that way.
On arriving back from American Samoa, Lange heads straight from the airport to a cabinet meeting. But by then, it's a done deal. The response will be no to the Buchanan, not enough information to permit. But how about the Americans send an Oliver Hazard Perry class instead? No thanks, say the Americans.
The decision that we made in Cabinet about it was effectively made before Lange came back because he didn't get there till after lunch. And it wasn't a very long debate or even controversial. And I think if we had decided anything else, there would have been a big uproar.
Some have suggested it suited Lange to be away when all this went down. Others reckon the US or Australia timed the leaks to emerge when he was deep in the Pacific. If it was a deliberate attempt on the part of the other ANZUS members to force the issue while Lange was floating in the South Seas, it backfired.
It completely backfired. Now, you can't see into the future. Time destroys many fighting faiths in politics. But the truth of the matter is that because of the leaks in Washington and Canberra, the people sort of sat up and said, hey, we're being attacked, so they supported the government's policy. The sense of New Zealanders was they didn't want a bar of nuclear weapons in New Zealand. And I think that was a good policy, and it led to our independent foreign policy, and now it's pretty widely accepted for a long time by all political parties.
We deeply regret the decision by the New Zealand government to deny port access to our ships. We consider New Zealand a friend. It's our deepest hope that New Zealand will restore the traditional cooperation that has existed between our two countries.
A CIA cable of the same time, since declassified, says the refusal increases Soviet incentives to promote disunity among our allies and compels the US to take a course of action that demonstrates to the government of New Zealand that it cannot enjoy the benefits of a good ally without fulfilling the commensurate responsibilities.
They have said that this will not be for New Zealand a cost-free policy. And I never thought it would be a cost-free policy. The cost is that the United States will say that we are now not as secure as we were, and they will see to it that there is a degree of embarrassment to this government.
Lange jokes that if the US really wanted to punish New Zealand, it would cut off Dallas and the A-Team. But the most entertaining reprisal doesn't come from Washington, it comes from Queensland and its consistently unhinged Premier, Joh Bjelke-Petersen. He orders officials to impound New Zealand-made Van Camp chocolate.
You've got to be positive and you've got to be strong, whether it's with unions or whether it's in foreign policy.
It doesn't last long, though, in part because what he was doing was illegal, and in part because it turns out the sugarcane for the chocolate comes from Queensland. Meanwhile, the French are resuming tests in the Pacific.
It is not a question of geological structure. It is a question of arrogance. It is a question of national pride, and it is simply a whole philosophy built up where they have chosen for donkey's years to inflict their weapons testing on other people for their defence, and that's unacceptable.
Here's Greenpeace New Zealand's Elaine Shaw.
Well, we will continue to protest as we have for the last 10 years. We hope that the new Labour government will continue its strong anti-nuclear stance and will take strong action against the French.
But I think we need now to go over to Europe and in France, start to say something to the socialists who made the promises before election and back down on them afterwards, and tell them what we think of that. Point out to the French people that they can now look forward to having these tests, which they say are so vital, in their own home, and then we'll see whether they think the whole deterrent program for France is so vital.
Lange doesn't need Palmer to tell him that there is disquiet, even alarm about the idea he might go to the Oxford Union for a debate on nukes. Since the invitation arrived at the end of 1984, well-intentioned officials from Foreign Affairs and the Beehive had been urging him not to do it. So too did the British Prime Minister.
Margaret Thatcher sent a note through her High Commissioner, which he delivered to me, asking me not to do it. And that sealed it as far as I was concerned. I told him what I thought of him and of his new hair dye and various other things like that. And I decided definitely to go. And we settled the terms of the debate. It was one of those interesting occasions when Foreign Affairs were put on the test. And I went to the UK without any Foreign Affairs official.
Typically, speeches on foreign affairs would be drafted by ministry specialists. In their absence, Lange turns to the speechwriter in his own office, Margaret Pope. By this point, he is not only admiring of her work in crafting an address, he has fallen in love with her. That had started to become clear to Pope late in 1984. She says to him, "Have a good break." He says something like, "I don't think that's possible without you around."
Just before Christmas that year, he spoke to me and said something that left me in absolutely no doubt that he did feel something for me.
This is Pope in 2011 talking to Catherine Ryan on RNZ. In 1984, Pope travels with Lange to the UK.
The ministry thought that our allies and our friendly powers like Great Britain would be offended by his taking part in the debate. And the strategy they adopted was to have it be a private visit. They would not send any officials with them, so it had to be arranged by David's office. They would not arrange for any official meetings, and they would not write the speech notes. So David called me round to his office one day and said that he was going to do this debate, and would I write it?
There's some last-minute wrangling about the motion. Falwell has agreed to debate that the Western nuclear alliance is morally indefensible. Even Lange knows that naming the Western alliance would be one too many pokes in the eye, so they end up with the motion that nuclear weapons are morally indefensible. In 1985, TV2 doesn't typically start broadcasting on Saturdays until noon, but it's fired up early on March the 2nd, with the debate airing live across the country from 10:25 a.m.
And now we come to the big moment of the evening, the speeches by the two heavyweights. First of all, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Mr. Lange, who will be followed by the Reverend Falwell. Mr. Lange comes to the dispatch box, and the House on both sides is rising to him. That is a very, very rare event in the Oxford Union. I'm not sure in the 25 years since I was president I've ever seen that happen here in this historic hall before. But he is having a most enthusiastic reception. Not quite everybody is on their feet, but a very large numbers. And it's on both sides of the House. It's a mark of courtesy and respect, as well as, in some cases, support for his views. Here is the Prime Minister.
Honourable members of the Union, ladies and gentlemen, in fact, if I could greet straight away, because I understand there is a direct feed to the White House tonight, if I could greet the President of the United States, who is, of course, at the very genesis of the proposition we're debating tonight.
Lange knows what it will mean if he messes this up.
I'd have been dog tucker if I'd blown that.
Instead, it turns out to be, by his own estimation, the highest point of my career in politics.
I hold that the character of nuclear weapons is such that their very existence corrupts the best of intentions, that the means, in fact, perverts the end. And I hold that their character is such that they have brought us to the greatest of all perversions, the belief that this evil is necessary, as it has been stated tonight, when in fact it is not.
He's in full flow, open-chested, expressive, hinging his arms like he's conducting an orchestra. But the moment that remains as encamped in the national memory as a Dave Dobbin song is, of course, this.
Mr. Lange, sir, if I may address you as mate, perhaps.
To be clear, this isn't Jerry Falwell, but an audience member who's bounded up to the dispatch box to challenge the Speaker, as is encouraged in these Oxford Union debates.
You've been talking about the quality of rationality. Now, I've heard many reasons advanced for keeping American sailors out of ports. Usually have something to do with the honor of the women involved or the property values of the ports.
Come on, mate, get on with it.
What I should like to know, sir, is why you don't do the honorable and the consistent thing and pull out of the ANZUS alliance, for whether you are snuggling up to the bomb or living in the peaceful shadow of the bomb, New Zealand benefits, sir.
The American has one hand behind his back, and with the other he's pointing and prodding across at Lange.
And that's the question with which we charge you, and that's the question with which we would like an answer, sir.
He returns to his seat.
And I'm going to give it to you if you hold your breath, just for a moment. I can smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it. I want to pass over here the preparations which are constantly being made for the winnable or even survivable nuclear war. I would ignore those and wholeheartedly embrace the logic of the unthinkable war if it could be established that the damage which could result from the collapse of that logic would be confined to nuclear weapon states.
But is Lange right that there is a direct feed to the White House? Are the Americans watching? I asked Richard Armitage if he remembers.
Of course, I remember.
How did that land? How did the remarks he made land in D.C.?
Like a turd in a punch bowl.
Here's Lange, 11 years later.
The one thing the Americans never forgave me for was that interjection. And that was deemed by them to have been a terrible slight in the relationship. And it says something for my inability to understand what American sensitivities are about.
Lange is lauded around the world, hailed as the poster boy for nuclear disarmament. It's quite a journey for someone who colleagues had called lukewarm on the issue just a few years earlier. Richard Prebble will later describe Lange as the accidental hero of the anti-nuclear movement.
Nuclear free was a bit of an accident.
Well, I think that's a little unkind. I think the hero thing's, well, yes, sometimes events make you heroes.
Just a few months after Lange gets a hero's welcome back from Europe, on a quiet Thursday night in July 1985, the Rainbow Warrior is moored at Marsden Wharf in Auckland. A converted trawler, the flagship of the Greenpeace fleet, is preparing to lead a flotilla to Mururoa to protest the French nuclear tests. Just minutes before midnight, 2 explosions rip through the hull. Fernando Pereira, a Portuguese photographer, is killed.
Leanne Malcolm filed this report from the scene a few minutes ago.
Explosions rang out from the 40-metre ship at about midnight, and the crew scrambled to get off the vessel to safety as she began going under. But one crew member was caught below decks, and police recovered his body early this morning.
It's not yet a year since Labour won the election.
We have a major criminal act. We have the implication of political or terrorist overtone. And we have, therefore, as a country, an urgent need to investigate it, and the police force of New Zealand are doing so efficiently, and they will be given every resource they need to do that. Skilled, ruthless, calculating people who would set out to murder others in this dispassionate way. One of the awful ironies of an act such as this is that while the malice, the spite, and the awful venom has been exacted against that ship and the life of that person, the cause has been immeasurably enhanced. People who would not have been in Greenpeace's corner are now standing right there in the ring with them. And that's something which the psychology of that particular act didn't take into account.
2 days later, as the French government denies any involvement, 2 of its citizens are detained in New Zealand. Alain Mafar and Dominique Prieur.
Last night, the inquiry took a dramatic turn when 2 people, a man and a woman, were arrested in connection with the sinking. They've been charged with murder, arson and conspiracy to commit arson and will appear today in the Auckland District Court.
About 6 weeks after the bombing, a French inquiry headed by Bernard Tricot releases its report. It finds no evidence that the agents had been ordered to attack the Greenpeace ship.
It is certainly not a whitewash. It is so transparent that it couldn't be called a whitewash. It is littered with inconsistencies. It skirts around facts. It has contradictions at key points. It is, in short, I think, true to say that Monsieur Tricot will live to be embarrassed by it. But more than that, I think the French government will live to be embarrassed by it. It is ticking away there, ready to erupt on them. And he elects, quite properly from the French perspective, to put a cloak of innocence over what is essentially, forgetting the 2 people in custody in New Zealand, a gross piece of espionage on the soil of a friendly country.
1 month later, the French Prime Minister, Laurent Fabius, delivers a statement.
The main revelation, the cruel truth, as Monsieur Fabius called it, was that DGSE agents, that is, agents of the French External Security Agency, had sunk the Rainbow Warrior and that they'd been acting on orders.
The French spooks had named it Operation Satanique. It had now become, in the words of Paris media, the French Watergate.
The sad thing is that what we now have is that this was no fortuitous beau geste, but it is instead a sordid act of international state-backed terrorism. And that is now acknowledged by the French government.
The Rainbow Warrior depositions hearing in Auckland this morning against 2 French agents came to an abrupt end.
The hearing, which was expected to last at least 2 weeks, ended when Dominique Prieur and Alain Maffard pleaded guilty to reduced charges of manslaughter and causing willful damage.
The two agents are sentenced to 10 years prison. Over time, both the arrogance and the idiocy of the Keystone Cop plot emerges. A group of agents from the French Secret Service had been dispatched to New Zealand, variously tasked with infiltrating Greenpeace, bringing in the explosives to the far north, transporting them down to Auckland and attaching them, limpet mines, to the hull of the ship. Prieur and Maffard, who had been posing as a newlywed Swiss couple and had been tasked with couriering the bombs to the divers, are arrested while waiting for a $130 refund for returning their campervan rental early at a Newman's branch in Mount Wellington. Not only had Paris underestimated New Zealand's ability to investigate its act of state terrorism, it had equally not figured with the tiny degrees of separation in the country. Some of the agents spent a couple of nights at a motel part-owned by David Lange. Another agent had a fling with the wife of a Whangarei policeman.
You can't have French people in a car sort of going down the island without New Zealanders noticing, and they all did, and the police found out exactly what was going on when it happened, and we damn near arrested them all as they escaped.
One French spy would later say that the agents had left behind them a trail so unsubtle and French that the only things missing were a baguette, a beret, and a bottle of Beaujolais.
The Rainbow Warrior was the defining moment for me because I knew that was the end of any New Zealand commitment to the so-called Western Alliance. It was not when it was sunk that I knew. It was when we knew who'd sunk it that I knew. And then the overwhelming silence from the Great Britain. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was prepared to condemn Gaddafi for everything, but the French could go and kill people in our harbour. Hawke never said a word. Ronald Reagan pretended total indifference. We never had a peep out of those people that we were allegedly in a Western alliance with, those people who fought for democracy. Our foreign policy stance had the seeds of its change in Labour and in my government. It was nurtured and watered by the American reprisals, but it was set in a hanging basket by the French.
Geoffrey Palmer is dispatched to Washington to see if a compromise can be reached on ship visits in ANZUS. It's a Hail Mary mission.
When I saw Schultz, I was convinced that they couldn't do it because he said the New Zealanders won't put up with it. I think that was pretty acute. And I thought, well, we can't do it.
Palmer heads to New York and the UN with another weighty foreign policy challenge on his plate, drawing a line under the dispute with France. Paris has been exposed as responsible for a terrorist act in New Zealand, but it wants its agents back. It's been threatening New Zealand's exports in Europe.
The Prime Minister announced last night that the fate of the two French agents in jail for their part in the Rainbow Warrior bombing will be decided by an independent arbitrator. David Lange confirmed that the United Nations Secretary-General, Perez de Cuellar, will have a free hand to decide all issues from the Rainbow Warrior case, including the agents' freedom, an apology and reparations.
That's the public story. The truth is that the real negotiation is happening elsewhere. Palmer and his French counterpart each appoint a top diplomat to go away and knuckle out a deal.
They did that in secret in Switzerland. And it was then submitted to Perez de Cuellar, who was the Secretary-General of the UN, and he approved everything that had been agreed, but he had to set the amount of compensation, and he set it. And I always thought that got us out of what was a very, very difficult situation with the French.
It's announced that New Zealand will get an apology and compensation of $13 million. France commits not to meddle with New Zealand's exports. Prieur and Maffard will complete their sentences on an atoll in French Polynesia.
If you're going to do diplomatic negotiations, you're never going to be able to do them in public. I mean, every time that happens, it sort of collapses. And it was, I think, very important that the imprimatur of the UN was on it, and it was on it, and I thought it was as good a way of settling an international dispute as you could get.
The Rainbow Warrior affair has fortified support for New Zealand's burgeoning sense of independence, of standing up to bigger, tougher powers. Some of that starts to erode, however, when a blasé France brings both agents home early under dodgy pretexts.
The public were absolutely outraged at what had happened, and rightly so.
Lange will later say that letting the agents leave New Zealand was one of his only regrets in politics.
But, in the end, you have to get disputes settled. In the end, New Zealand has to act very reasonably on everything because it is small. We do not carry a big stick.
In the middle of 1986, David Lange and George Shultz meet for about half an hour on the sidelines of a regional summit in Manila. It's a stalemate. "Shultz ends US vow to defend New Zealand," reads the headline in the next day's New York Times. "We part as friends," Shultz famously tells media, "but we part company as far as the alliance is concerned."
The sadness, disappointment, disbelief. Look, we grew up listening at the tales of this, particularly of Australia and New Zealand, in Fiji, in the islands, in Italy, in Greece, during the Second World War. So there was a bit of incredulity, and as relatively devastating for New Zealand as this semi-divorce may have seemed, it was also pretty devastating to us, but we had much greater equities, and we weren't going to sacrifice any of them.
A year on, Labour puts its commitments into law, passing the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act.
This morning's Dominion leads with the government's anti-nuclear legislation passing into law on a 39-29 vote in Parliament last night, after what it describes as a rowdy and emotional debate, and follows up inside with reports on celebrations by peace groups outside Parliament.
The legislation remains in force 37 years on.
We are not anymore some sort of integral part of someone else's defence strategy. This is a defence strategy for New Zealand.
But what was the truth of that meeting on July 16, 2 days after the election? Shultz is determined Lange had told him he'd soften the nuclear stance within 6 months. Lange says it requires a fevered imagination to believe that. There's another New Zealander in the room that day, Merv Norrish, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs and no great fan of Lange's nuclear stance. 20 years afterwards, in 2004, he speaks at a conference discussing the first term of that government.
The Secretary of State convinced himself that David Lange had intimated that over the following 6 months he would bring about some change in his party's policy on nuclear ship visits. I was the only other person there, and I did not interpret Mr. Lange's comments that way. He did indeed say that he would be talking to party members about the issue at Labour Party conferences over the 6 months ahead. Perhaps there was ambiguity there, but he did not say that he would bring about a changed outcome. It seems to me that George Shultz heard what he wanted to hear, and unfortunately this misunderstanding subsequently coloured Mr. Shultz's attitude to Mr. Lange.
The most likely explanation? Something was lost in translation.
Lange spoke so elliptically that it's entirely possible that everyone at that meeting took away a different impression of what he said.
Merv Norrish didn't hear any commitment.
But of course he would understand Lange speak and Shultz might not.
It's easy to forget that all of this is happening at the same time that Roger Douglas and his troika are embarked on an extraordinary overhaul of the political economy. Then and since, some have asked, was a deal struck? Something like, do what you like on the economy as long as you stand firm on nukes.
There was never, as some people suggested, at least to my knowledge, a trade-off. I just think it wasn't something you'd die in a ditch for if economics was your primary purpose, because it was going to happen anyway. And why would you risk that division?
I think it kind of kept some on the left that, at least we could still vote Labour. David was definitely representing them in those policy areas.
It took focus away from what we were doing. It didn't impact what I did, but on the other hand, I think I benefited from it.
Towards the end of that wild parliamentary term, pressure is building in a transformed New Zealand. Plans are being laid for another election. A liberated investor class is euphoric, high on champagne and stock prices. And then a crash. pain, and an ongoing reckoning. That's next in episode 4 of Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government, is written and presented by me, Toby Manhire, for the Spin-Off Podcast Network, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. The producer is Sophie Dowson, the audio editor and sound designer is Tiahe Butler, the researchers are Hannah Lou and Rachel Judkins, the graphic designer is Archie Banal, and the executive producers are Duncan Grieve and Jane Yee. Archival audio in this episode is from the RNZ collection at Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision and Radio New Zealand. You can read a full list of sources and a bunch of other written material that digs deeper into the story by clicking the link in the show notes. Thanks to Steve Russell, Finney McDonald, Amber Easby, Mad Chapman, Anna Rafferty-Connell, Jen Follett, Isaiah Tua, Ben Fagan, Bernard Hickey, and everyone who made the time to speak with us. Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire. Thank you for listening to Juggernaut. I hope you're enjoying this series. A lot of work from a small but talented group of people went into making this podcast, and we're extremely grateful to New Zealand On Air for supporting the project. It also couldn't have happened without the support of our members. If you like what we do here at The Spin-Off and would like to see more projects like Juggernaut out in the world, then please consider becoming a Spin-Off member. Visit thespinoff.co.nz/members to help us do more of the work you value.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.